Hello, U.S. history. Welcome to another Varela's videos. So we are looking at part two of the Roaring Twenties, the 1920s booming economy. This is going to be our second set of notes for not only this lecture, but also for Unit 5. So you can continue on with the notes. I would just maybe draw a line to separate out part one from part two, or you're welcome to turn the page, whatever is easier for you. But definitely note these so when we do notebook check, I can see part one from part two. And it's always great to use the date. So put today's date on there. All right, so we talked about in our first part one video the ideas of the youth, sort of youth ideas, and how young people are kind of starting to go against older people. Children might start to have different ideas from their parents. And I want you to become familiar with this phrase, culture clash, because that's really what we're starting to see for the first time when it comes to age. Yes, we've had culture clashes with slavery and anti-slavery, with North versus South, but this is really with young people and old people. You could also argue it's more of a clash between living in the cities and living out in the more rural areas. So when it comes to education, the idea of Charles Darwin and all of his ideas of natural selection and evolution have been known for about 50 years at this point. But what's starting to happen is that in parts of the country, evolution is not being taught in public schools. And if you are aware, the theory of evolution does contradict what is said in the Bible about how human beings are created. And so this culminates with a very famous incident slash event called the Scopes monkey trial. And basically, what happened was we are in the state of Tennessee, so it is a southern state. In 1925, Tennessee makes it illegal to teach evolution in public schools. And remember, there are private schools. Private schools exist in the 1920s. There are religious schools. So if you were someone who is very strong in your faith and you want to only be taught what's in the Bible, there are private schools available to you. Public schools, however, are funded with tax dollars. And so this is an interesting sort of blending of one of our amendments, the First Amendment, that seems to be blurring the line between religion and public education. So a teacher is going to challenge us because lots of teachers challenge. So that teacher was named John Scopes. That's why it's called Scopes trial. And he decides that he is going to teach evolution in his school. And he is found guilty. So there is a case of a teacher teaching, a science teacher, teaching science, teaching the theory of evolution, which is proven by Charles Darwin, and he goes to jail for teaching the truth. That is very frightening to me, especially as a history teacher. And what starts to happen is this idea takes hold in the South that evolution cannot be taught in public schools. So when we talked about the sort of youth versus older people, many young people were on the side of John Scopes, the teacher. They thought that let's believe in science. And you're going to start to see that older people did not. And politics aside right now with COVID-19, but it is a very sort of weirdly sort of like how history can repeat itself. There is sort of a weird sort of echo, I feel like, of this idea happening in 2020, now going into 2021, with how different individuals feel about COVID-19. So this is definitely, you could argue, urban versus rural. It's also, though, youth versus older America. Here's a very famous poster that came from it. Think of your three emojis on your phone, the three monkeys, speak no evil, hear no evil, see no evil. So the idea of, we're not talking about something that might actually be scientifically truthful. It's interesting. And again, it can be, I think in a way, philosophically dangerous. Nothing to write down here, just look at the picture. So continuing with culture clash, these people are pouring alcohol into the streets. What is happening? It is prohibition. The 18th Amendment, we banned alcohol before we let women vote. Go figure. But the 18th Amendment was passed earlier in 1920. What does it do? It creates this idea of prohibition. It bans the manufacturing, the transportation, and the sale of alcohol. Now, they don't say the consumption usually because there is this weird sort of loophole when it comes to religious services. If you belong to church or if you've gone to church services where in communion often you may drink wine, that was still allowed because that was considered the blood of Christ. It was part of a religious ceremony. And in most definitions, you won't see the word consumption. You just see manufacture, transportation, and sale. But hello, of course, you're going to consume it. So, what happens? The minute you make something illegal, people want to do it. So, this is where we start to see the rise of criminal activity, mob activity, speakeasies, those hidden sort of bars and gin joints where people would go and drink. This is kind of interesting because also it's going to be very popular with young people. And it's bad because if you look at it, the 18th Amendment is going to be passed in 1920. The 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. The 20th Amendment is actually going to move the inauguration. It's going to move the president used to take office. The new president would start his term in March. It's going to get moved back to January, and that's where it is today. So that's the 20th Amendment. And the 21st Amendment is like, oh gosh, please give us our alcohol back. We're in the thick of the Great Depression. We need a drink. So the end of Prohibition is going to be actually 13 years later. And it will be the only time an amendment's been repealed, and that's going to be the 21st Amendment, is going to repeal the 18th Amendment, which began Prohibition. But for that time period, no alcohol legally. Of course, people are going to be doing it illegally. That will lead to the rise of gangs, as we talked about. Here's a very famous picture of Al Capone. We're going to be watching a video in class that will give you some of the ins and outs of some of this mob violence and the rise of organized crime. Many people contribute the rise of the mafia, so to speak, to the idea of prohibition. And the minute it was made illegal, it's going to become a very lucrative and financially sort of viable opportunity for mobsters. So, and that's exactly what happened. Your speakeasy is one of my favorite signs here. It says, in compliance with the 18th Amendment, no intoxicating liquor allowed on the premises. So they're holding the sign literally surrounded by all this alcohol. Because, and if you notice, it's young people in this case, but also older people. Prohibition is sort of the one area where it wasn't as defining of an age divide because there were older people that definitely partook for sure. So it's just more of, are you going to follow the law or not? And most people thought this law was ridiculous. They are not going to follow it. Okay, continuing also with culture clash is this phrase called the lost generation, which refers to really a literature movement, but also a group of young people in the 1920s who basically have lost their faith. Some of the most famous names, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, T.S. Eliot. This is the sort of definition right here, this pessimistic outlook stemming from World War I. So we're looking at a group of young writers who feel like World War I was awful. Over 10 million people died, not just soldiers, civilians as well. We're looking at land destroyed and the brutality of trench warfare, in particular in Western Europe. When the survivors of the war came back and told their stories, or when photographs of the war came out, there had never been a war of such magnitude that people just can't believe that we did that as human beings to one another. And therefore, they have this attitude of sort of party it up, eat, drink, and be merry because nothing really matters. And, basically, we're all going to die at some point, probably sooner rather than later. So you should enjoy yourself. It was a very dark attitude, and you could kind of see that attitude in some of the works. The most famous being F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. Okay, so moving on to another area of culture clash is actually with immigration. And you can see here a lot of European immigrants in this cartoon. This is like a funnel, like an oil funnel, basically. The only way to handle it is to funnel them all in. So only a few are actually coming into the USA, as you can see. Here's our Uncle Sam figure. Immigration is going to go through kind of a spike in the 1920s. So much so that we begin to restrict it. And when I say we, I mean our government. We try to administer what are called home language literacy tests. So we try to give immigrants who want to come to this country a test in their home language and their native language, and they have to be able to pass it. That is met with some sort of questionable, like, is that really fair? Is that so? We're saying if you can't read in your own language, you can't come to this country at all. So that's going to be replaced with something called the Quota Act. And basically, the Quota Act established a number. It was kind of an arbitrary number that said only this many people from your country are allowed into our country. And that's what's happening here. So you're kind of funneling it down. So in this case, it's saying 3%. Only 3% of the people are going to get in. The Quota Act is going to be replaced by the National Origins Act, and this is going to be in effect for a very long time. The National Origins Act basically says that immigrants from a specific country cannot exceed 2% of the number of people from that same country, of that nationality, who were living in the US in the year 1890. So yes, it's a lot. It's a lot there. But this became more of a way to say if there were a lot of immigrants from your particular country in the United States, then you're in luck. However, if you come from a smaller country, your chances of getting in are very it's much more difficult. But the National Origins Act is going to be around until the 1940s. So this becomes our immigration policy starting in the 1920s, and it lasts for at least another 20 years. So I wouldn't say it's exactly welcoming, and it is almost trying to deter, but people still want to come to the United States. Why are we doing this? Well, we're going to learn about the Red Scare again in the 1950s. But basically, the Red Scare of the sort of right after World War I, the 1920s, is sort of a reaction to communism. At this point, communism has taken over in what is now going to be the Soviet Union. It's still Russia for a little bit, and it officially changed its name, I believe, in 1922. It becomes the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But either way, we are afraid that communism and anything that seems to be looking like socialism could come to the US. And so we want to limit immigration, especially from Eastern Europe. More on the Red Scare later. And then, of course, we know who these men are, the infamous and terrible KKK. But now in the 20s, we have what's called the new KKK. And we know originally the KKK is created during Reconstruction, so post Civil War. What'll happen though is it goes away and then it comes back. And at its height, it's going to have about 4 to 5 million members. So, I mean, that's a lot of people. One of their leaders in the 1920s becomes very outspoken was a man named David Stevenson. So definitely not so secret. But what they're doing in the 20s is kind of similar to what they were doing before, which is burning the crosses, boycotting Black-owned businesses or businesses owned by any kind of ethnic minority, terrorizing. This is the same time period. I'm sure you heard about it during the summer of the Tulsa Race Massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma. That was in June of 1921, where basically you had a very successful and vibrant Black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that was torn apart by white racists of Oklahoma. This sort of bolden action to target especially Black businesses increases in the 1920s. So the KKK definitely sees a resurgence. So this, again, not so much an age thing here. This is clearly a racial issue. What is different, though, I think, is the response. And what happens is we become much more vocal as a society against the KKK. And we don't leave it just to Black Americans. We know the NAACP has already formed, that formed in 1909, but you also see groups like the Jewish Anti-Defamation League form, and these groups tend to work together to target the actions of the KKK. Plus, the Klan becomes a little corrupt. They start to realize that there are leaders who are taking money from members, that are um, involving themselves in sort of shady business dealings. The actual leader, David Stevenson, actually is finally arrested and prosecuted and found guilty of murder and assault. So you start to see some of the high profile leaders of the KKK actually go to jail. So right as the KKK was trying to come back, by the time the 20s come to an end, it sort of squashed back down again. I wish I could say it's gone forever, but we know that's not true. It's going to come back again when we talk about voter registration and voter rights and the Civil Rights Act of the 1950s and 60s. But I think what I do feel proud about as Americans is that white people start to speak out against the KKK. It's not just the responsibility of Black Americans. White Americans get involved as well. And that's really for the first time, I think, in the 1920s. And it has to come back again in the 1950s and 60s. Okay, so that's the 1920s for right now. We're going to stop here. And what we're going to do is look at our next video notes. We'll be dealing with the Great Depression. So hopefully took some good notes, and I will see you in class.